In the spring of 1979, Gerald Hoffman was 43 years old and milking 32 cows on 160 acres outside of Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin. The herd was mixed, Jerseys mostly, some Guernseys, a few brown Swiss, small cows, efficient cows. They didn't produce massive quantities, but they produced consistently, 50 pounds of milk per cow per day on average. The butterfat content was high, which brought a premium. The cows were easy to manage. They calved without trouble. They stayed healthy on moderate feed. Gerald had been milking this same type of herd since he took over the farm from his father in 1964. 15 years of the same routine, the same rhythm, the same quiet predictability. But in 1979, the dairy industry was changing. Milk prices had stagnated while feed costs climbed. The economics were tightening. Farms that had been profitable on 40 cows now needed 60 to break even. Farms that had survived on moderate production now needed volume. Gerald watched his neighbors expand. He watched them build new barns, install bulk tanks, switch to higher-producing breeds. The conversations at the co-op shifted. People talked about pounds per cow, about efficiency, about maximizing production per unit of labor. The small, quiet dairy operations were becoming relics. The future, everyone said, was Holstein. Gerald resisted for a while. He liked his mixed herd. He liked the variety, the hardiness, the fact that he could manage them alone without constant intervention. His wife, Diane, helped with feeding and some of the barn work, but she also managed the household and raised their 2 daughters. The farm ran smoothly because it was simple. 32 cows, twice a day milking, pasture in summer, hay in winter, grain supplementation but not excessive. The cows lived long lives, 10, 12, sometimes 14 years. Gerald knew each one by name, by temperament, by lineage. The farm wasn't making them wealthy, but it was paying the bills. But in the spring of 1979, Gerald's main tractor broke down. It was a 15-year-old Ford, and the transmission was gone. The repair estimate came in at $1,200, which was nearly as much as the tractor was worth. Gerald talked to the implement dealer in town about options. The dealer showed him a used Massey Ferguson, a bigger machine with more horsepower, a newer model with a loader attachment. The price was $6,800. Gerald didn't have $6,800 in cash, but the dealer offered financing. Low interest, 5-year term, payments of about $130 a month. Gerald stood in the dealership lot and looked at the Massey. It was red and solid and far more capable than anything he'd owned before. The loader would make feeding easier. The extra horsepower would let him work ground faster, pull heavier equipment, handle manure spreading with less effort. It made sense. The farm needed a reliable tractor. The Ford was finished, but $130 a month was a significant addition to his expenses. He'd need to increase income to cover it. The dealer asked Gerald how many cows he was milking. Gerald said 32. The dealer asked what kind. Gerald said mostly Jerseys. The dealer nodded and said that if Gerald wanted to make the tractor payment work, he might want to think about production. More milk per cow meant more income without adding cows. And if he didn't want to add cows, switching to a breed that naturally produced more would close the gap. The dealer wasn't a dairy farmer, but he'd sold equipment to enough of them to know the economics. He mentioned that several farmers in the area had gone to Holstein and hadn't regretted it. Gerald bought the Massey Ferguson. He signed the financing paperwork on a Thursday afternoon in late April. The payments would start in June. He drove the tractor home and felt the weight of the decision settle over him. $130 a month for 5 years. $7,800 total with interest. It was the largest debt he'd carried since buying out his father's share of the farm 15 years earlier, and it meant the farm had to produce more. That summer, Gerald started researching Holstein genetics. He attended a dairy meeting in Fond du Lac, where a university extension agent presented data on breed comparisons. Holsteins, the agent explained, were the highest volume producers in the industry. An average Holstein could produce 70 to 80 pounds of milk per day, nearly 50% more than a Jersey. The butterfat percentage was lower, but the sheer volume compensated. And the industry was shifting toward pricing based on hundredweight rather than butterfat content, which favored high-volume production. The agent also talked about management intensity. Holsteins required more feed. They were larger animals with higher metabolic demands. They needed more grain, more protein, more careful ration balancing. They were more prone to metabolic disorders like milk fever and ketosis. They had shorter productive lifespans than smaller breeds. But if managed correctly, the agent said, they were the most profitable option for commercial dairy. Gerald took notes. He asked questions. He talked to other farmers who'd made the switch. Most of them reported increased income, though they also reported increased costs. More feed, more vet bills, more time spent managing health issues. But the consensus was that Holsteins were the direction the industry was moving, and farms that didn't adapt would be left behind. In the fall of 1979, Gerald made the decision. He would transition his herd to Holstein. Not all at once, but gradually. He'd sell off the older Jerseys and Guernseys as they aged out and replace them with Holstein heifers. Over 3 to 5 years, the herd would convert. Production would increase. Income would rise. The tractor payment would be manageable. It was logical. It was what everyone else was doing. It was the future. Gerald bought his first Holstein heifer in November of 1979. She came from a farm near Plymouth, a large operation with a registered herd and proven genetics. The heifer was 6 months old, black and white, tall and angular. She cost $450, which was 3 times what Gerald usually paid for a Jersey heifer. But she came from a dam that produced 90 pounds of milk per day, and the seller guaranteed her quality. Gerald brought her home and put her in the barn with the younger stock. She looked enormous next to the Jerseys. Over the next 18 months, Gerald bought 4 more Holstein heifers. He also bred several of his younger Jersey and Guernsey cows to a Holstein bull, creating crossbreds that would carry some of the volume genetics. By the spring of 1981, the first purebred Holstein heifer freshened. Gerald named her Daisy, though she didn't look like any Daisy he'd known before. She was massive, 1,400 pounds, nearly twice the size of his Jerseys. Her udder was large and tight, her frame stretched and bony. Daisy produced. In her first lactation, she averaged 78 pounds of milk per day. Gerald was stunned. He'd never seen production like that from a single cow. The milk check started reflecting it. With Daisy and the crossbreds contributing, his monthly income increased by about $200. It was working. The Holsteins were delivering what they'd promised. But Daisy also required more attention than Gerald was used to. She ate nearly twice as much grain as the Jerseys. Her feed costs alone were significantly higher. She developed milk fever 3 days after calving, a metabolic condition caused by calcium depletion. Gerald had to call the vet, who administered an IV calcium solution. The vet bill was $65. Daisy recovered, but it was an intervention Gerald had never needed with his smaller cows. The vet told him that Holsteins were prone to milk fever, especially high producers. Gerald would need to watch for it in future calvings. By 1982, Gerald had 8 Holsteins in his milking herd, along with 24 Jerseys and Guernseys. The Holsteins were producing an average of 75 pounds per day. The smaller cows were still at 50. The overall herd average had increased to about 60 pounds per cow per day. Gerald's milk checks were up. He was covering the tractor payment with room to spare. But the workload had changed. The Holsteins required more feed management. Gerald had to mix rations more carefully, balancing energy and protein to support high production without causing digestive upset. He bought a grain mixer and spent more time calculating feed ratios. The Holsteins also had more health issues: retained placentas after calving, displaced abomasums, a condition where the stomach twisted and required surgical correction, mastitis, udder infections that required antibiotics and sometimes resulted in lost quarters. Gerald's vet bills, which had averaged about $300 a year, climbed to over $1,000. The Holsteins also didn't last as long. Gerald's Jerseys routinely produced for 10 or 12 years. The Holsteins seemed to wear out after 5 or 6 lactations. The metabolic strain of high production took a toll. Cows that had been vigorous and productive in their 2nd and 3rd lactations were often culled by their 6th due to declining health or fertility issues. Gerald found himself replacing Holsteins more frequently than he'd ever replaced Jerseys. But the income was there. By 1983, Gerald's herd was split almost evenly. 16 Holsteins, 16 Jerseys, and crossbreds. His production had increased to an average of 65 pounds per cow per day. His annual milk sales were up by nearly 30% compared to 1979. He'd paid off the Massey Ferguson a year early. The farm was generating more revenue than it ever had, but it was also consuming more of Gerald's time and energy. The quiet rhythm of the farm had disappeared. Before the Holsteins, Gerald's barn work had been predictable. Morning milking, evening milking, routine checks, occasional issues. Now there was always something. A cow with ketosis, a cow with a twisted stomach, a cow that wouldn't breed back, a cow that developed an infection. Gerald spent more time on the phone with the vet, more time administering treatments, more time monitoring individual animals. The Holsteins demanded constant attention. Diane noticed the change. She told Gerald in the winter of 1983 that he seemed tired all the time. He was in the barn earlier in the mornings and later in the evenings. He was working through meals. He wasn't sleeping well. Gerald admitted that the Holsteins were more work than he'd anticipated, but he said it was worth it. The income proved it. They were making money. They were staying competitive. The farm was surviving. But something had shifted that Gerald didn't fully acknowledge. The relationship between farmer and animal had changed. With the Jerseys, Gerald had known each cow as an individual. He'd known their personalities, their quirks, their preferences. He'd known which cows were skittish and which were calm, which ones preferred the corner stall and which ones liked the middle. He'd had time to notice those things because the management was less intensive. With the Holsteins, the focus was production. Each cow was a unit of output. Gerald tracked their milk weights daily, monitored their feed intake, calculated their production efficiency. The cows had names, but they were primarily identified by their numbers and their performance metrics. When a Holstein's production dropped, Gerald evaluated whether to keep breeding her or cull her. The decision was economic. There wasn't room for sentiment when an animal was consuming $100 of feed per month and only producing $80 of milk. By 1985, Gerald's herd was almost entirely Holstein. He'd sold off the last of the old Jerseys, keeping only a few crossbreds that still performed well. His production had climbed to 70 pounds per cow per day. He was milking 35 cows now, 3 more than he'd started with in 1979, and producing more than double the milk. His income had increased substantially. He'd upgraded his bulk tank, improved his milking equipment, and added a second silo for feed storage. The farm looked more modern, more professional. But Gerald was 50 years old by then, and the work was wearing on him. The Holsteins required earlier mornings because high-producing cows needed to be milked on a strict 12-hour schedule. Any delay caused discomfort and increased the risk of mastitis. Gerald was in the barn by 4:30 every morning, 7 days a week. Diane helped when she could, but she was managing the household and dealing with her own health issues. Their daughters had grown and moved away. Gerald was doing most of the barn work alone. The physical toll was becoming apparent. Gerald's back ached constantly from the repeated bending and lifting. His hands were stiff from the cold and the wet. He'd developed a persistent cough from the barn dust and ammonia. He rarely took a full day off. Even on Sundays, the cows needed milking. The intensity never let up. In 1986, one of the Holsteins developed hardware disease, a condition where a cow ingests a metal object that punctures the stomach. The vet performed surgery, installing a magnet in the cow's stomach to prevent further damage. The procedure cost $350. The cow survived but never produced at the same level again. Gerald kept her for another lactation and then sold her at auction for beef. She was only 6 years old. That same year, Gerald lost 2 cows to metabolic disorders. One developed milk fever so severe that she went down and couldn't recover despite treatment. The other had a twisted stomach that wasn't caught in time. Both cows were high producers, both were in their prime lactations, and both represented significant financial losses. Gerald's gross income was up, but his net income wasn't rising proportionally. The costs of maintaining a high-production Holstein herd were eating into the gains. In 1987, milk prices dropped. It wasn't a catastrophic drop, but it was enough to compress margins. Gerald's feed costs hadn't declined, his vet bills hadn't declined, but his revenue per hundredweight fell by about 80 cents. Over the course of a year, that translated to a loss of several $1,000s. Gerald had to work harder just to stay even. He thought about scaling back. He thought about reducing the herd size, simplifying the operation, returning to a more manageable system. But he'd built the infrastructure around 35 Holsteins. The barn was sized for it. The equipment was sized for it. The feeding system was sized for it. Scaling back would mean underutilizing assets, which was its own form of inefficiency. And the debt he'd taken on for upgrades required a certain level of income to service. He was locked into the system he'd created. By 1990, Gerald was 54. His health was declining. He'd developed high blood pressure, which the doctor attributed to stress and poor diet. He was taking medication for it. He'd also developed arthritis in his knees and hands, which made the physical work harder. Diane suggested he consider selling the herd and leasing out the land. They could live on the lease income and Social Security once Gerald qualified. It would be a quieter life, less strain, less worry. But Gerald wasn't ready. He'd been farming for 41 years. He'd taken over the farm at 25 and built it into something viable. The idea of walking away felt like failure, even though he knew it wasn't. Farmers retired, farms changed hands. It was natural. But Gerald couldn't let go. In 1991, one of the Holsteins calved with severe complications. The calf was too large and the cow struggled for hours. Gerald called the vet, but by the time help arrived, the cow was in shock. They managed to deliver the calf, but the cow died 2 hours later. She was 4 years old, one of the highest producers in the herd. Gerald buried her in the back pasture with the Massey tractor he'd bought 12 years earlier to improve efficiency. That moment, standing beside the grave with the tractor idling, Gerald realized how far he'd come from the farm he'd inherited in 1964. The quiet mixed herd, the jerseys that calved easily and lived long lives, the rhythm that allowed time to know each animal. He'd traded all of that for production, for volume, for the ability to compete in an industry that demanded scale. And he'd succeeded by the industry's metrics. His farm was viable, his production was strong. His income was sufficient, but the cost had been the quiet. The Holsteins never allowed a quiet season. They were always demanding something, more feed, more attention, more intervention. They were bred for maximum output, and maximum output required maximum input. There was no coasting, there was no easy year. Every season was intense because the animals themselves were intense. Gerald continued farming through the 90s, though the strain became more visible each year. He hired occasional help during peak seasons, which cut into profits but allowed him to keep operating. He didn't expand further. He didn't chase the next trend. He simply maintained. 35 Holsteins. Twice a day milking. High production. High stress. The farm became a machine that required constant feeding and constant maintenance. Tough. And Gerald was the operator who couldn't step away. In 1998, Diane's health deteriorated significantly. She was diagnosed with congestive heart failure and needed regular medical care. Gerald's focus shifted. The farm became secondary to his wife's well-being. He started making decisions with the end in mind. He contacted a farm broker and listed the operation for sale. The land, the buildings, the herd, the equipment, everything. The farm sold in 1999 to a younger couple who wanted to expand their existing dairy operation. They kept the Holsteins for one lactation and then converted the herd to organic production with a different genetic focus. Gerald stayed on for a few months to help with the transition, but mostly he watched. The new owners were energetic and optimistic. They talked about sustainability and soil health and grass-based dairying. Gerald listened and didn't say much. They were building a different kind of farm. Diane passed away in 2001. Gerald moved into a small house in Sheboygan Falls, close to medical services and family. He didn't keep animals anymore. He drove past the old farm occasionally. The barn was still standing. The Massey was still there, though the new owners had bought newer equipment. The farm looked different, felt different, operated on different principles. In 2005, Gerald attended a dairy heritage event at the county fairgrounds. The organizers had set up displays showing the history of Wisconsin dairying, including exhibits on different breeds. There was a section on jerseys, with photos of small golden cows and farmers from the 50s and 60s. Gerald stood in front of the display for a long time. He remembered those cows. He remembered the ease of managing them. He remembered mornings in the barn that felt peaceful instead of urgent. A younger farmer approached and asked if Gerald had milked jerseys. Gerald said he had, for 15 years. The younger farmer asked why he'd switched. Gerald paused, then said he'd bought a tractor and needed to make the payment. The younger farmer laughed, thinking it was a joke. But Gerald didn't laugh. He said it was true. The tractor payment had pushed him toward higher production, and higher production meant Holsteins. And once he had Holsteins, the whole farm changed. The younger farmer asked if Gerald regretted it. Gerald thought about the question for a long time. He said he didn't regret adapting to survive. The industry had changed, and he'd changed with it. But he regretted losing the quiet. He regretted the 20 years of constant intensity, the health problems, the stress, the transformation of the farm from a place of rhythm into a place of relentless demand. He said the Holsteins had been profitable, but they'd also been exhausting, and he'd never had another quiet season after 1979. The younger farmer thanked him and moved on. Gerald stayed at the display, looking at the photos of jerseys, remembering the farm as it had been before he'd bought the Massey, before he'd committed to volume production, before he'd traded simplicity for scale. Gerald Hoffman passed away in 2012 at the age of 76. His obituary mentioned his decades of dairy farming and his dedication to agriculture. It didn't mention the Holsteins or the jerseys or the Massey Ferguson. Those details were too specific for general notice. But the people who'd known Gerald, the farmers who'd worked alongside him, they remembered. They remembered the transition he'd made in 1979. They remembered how the farm had changed. The farm Gerald had sold in 1999 was still operating in 2012, though under different management again. The organic operation hadn't lasted. The new owners had converted back to conventional dairying with a focus on grazing and lower input systems. The Holsteins were gone, replaced by crossbreds designed for longevity and efficiency rather than maximum production. The Massey Ferguson tractor was long gone, sold at an estate auction years earlier. It had served its purpose, done the work it was designed to do, justified its cost through decades of use. But the debt it had created in 1979 had set events in motion that Gerald couldn't have fully anticipated. The tractor payment had pushed him toward Holsteins. The Holsteins had pushed him toward higher production. Higher production had pushed him toward constant intensity. And constant intensity had defined the last 20 years of his farming life. The decision to buy the tractor hadn't been wrong. The decision to switch to Holsteins hadn't been wrong. Both were logical responses to economic pressures. But together, they'd created a system that demanded more than Gerald had realized he'd be required to give. More time, more energy, more stress, more of himself. Gerald had survived it. He'd made it work for 2 decades. He'd kept the farm viable long enough to sell it intact. But he'd paid a price that wasn't reflected in income statements or production records. He'd paid in health, in rest, in peace, in the quiet mornings that never returned after he brought home the first Holstein. And the lesson, if there was one, wasn't that Holsteins were bad or that bigger equipment was a mistake. The lesson was that every decision created a system, and every system had demands, and those demands accumulated over time. A tractor payment led to production pressure. Production pressure led to breed changes. Breed changes led to management intensity. Management intensity led to exhaustion that lasted decades. The jerseys he'd milked in the 70s were long dead. The Holsteins he'd milked in the 90s were long dead. The farm had cycled through generations of cattle, equipment, and farmers. But the story remained, carried in the memories of people who'd witnessed the transition, who'd seen what happened when a man bought a tractor and chose a breed in the same year and discovered that the 2 decisions, made separately, created a reality he hadn't planned for. The story wasn't dramatic. There was no catastrophic failure, no bankruptcy, no collapse. It was quieter than that. It was the slow erosion of ease, the gradual accumulation of strain, the transformation of a manageable operation into an all-consuming one. Gerald had experienced both. He'd known the farm before, when it allowed space to breathe, and he'd known it after, when it demanded everything. The after had lasted far longer than the before. 20 years of intensity against 15 years of quiet. But the dairy industry didn't measure quiet. It measured production, efficiency, profitability. And by those metrics, Gerald's transition to Holsteins had been successful. He'd increased output. He'd stayed competitive. He'd survived when other small dairies failed. But Gerald, in the years after he sold the farm, didn't feel successful. He felt tired. He felt worn. He felt like he'd spent 2 decades running just to stay in place. And when he thought about the farm, he didn't think about production records or income gains. He thought about the jerseys. He thought about the mornings when the work flowed easily. He thought about the time before he'd bought the Massey Ferguson and switched to Holstein in the same year. He thought about the quiet seasons he'd never had again,